Well, basically, disasters teach us to live in the now, in the present, and that things can be impermanent, and that death is imminent, and that we need to look at our humanity because we actually get in touch with our humanity in times of disaster. In our programs, we work in an integrative model, which includes men in the Men's Behaviour Change Program, women in the Women's Outreach Program, and the children in the Children's Program. So we're trying to look at the issue in a very holistic, integrative model, but the problem is that it's overflowing. The problem of violence is so big that we can't encapsulate it and look at it in a vacuum. We have to look at it as a community issue. We have to look at it as a societal issue, both locally and globally and internationally. To make a difference with the emergence of family violence after a bushfire, we need to address the gender issues that are happening now, because every issue is magnified. It's become a big issue. We can see that the problems are just trickling out. So we need to recognise that the statistics that we heard about earlier this morning about 1 in every 3 households experiencing violence is a very big reality. And then imagine that in a time of disaster, what the tipping point is going to be. So what do women want? What do women want out there? Women want to know that they are believed, that they can trust in what they say is going to stay confidential, that who they're telling this story to is going to have the skills to help navigate, to help find outcomes and to find out solutions for the woman. And women believe, however, there's lots of questions in her mind. She needs to overcome those questions about, whether she can manage financially on her own, is she going to be safe to leave this situation. And women, we know, take often 7 times of actually leaving the partner to actually leave. So there's a lot of times where they think about leaving and they've left, but 7 is often the average number that they leave. So post-disaster, she may be thinking, no, this is really a bad time. This is a really bad time because suddenly she's feeling more vulnerable, the parameters of the house is gone, and that's where violence breeds, in the house, in privacy. So now it's all out in the open, and she may be very confused about that. So women worry about the shame and the stigma attached to disclosing. She may be worried that she's going to be reported to protective services. She may be pressured to get intervention orders, and she may not want that. It's really about asking the woman what she wants. So natural disasters, Premier Burgess, destabilise the power dynamics in our community, and they shift what our values are. It goes back to what do we value as a community. So fundamentally, we can't address the issues of family violence without looking at significant structural changes, both politically, economically, and look at all aspects about relating. So we need to really help the people who are feeling disempowered in the situation of family violence.
Detective Inspector Heinem, did the police know about family violence in private homes following the bushfires?
We're absolutely aware of the mindset of family violence, and to some degree we do rely on members of the public either calling 000 or coming into the police station to tell us. However, we already work within an integrated system, so we have specialist workers in the field, family violence advisors, of whom we have several in the audience here today, and we have family violence liaison officers at every 24-hour station and every cluster of smaller rural stations, and those people in those positions are specifically trained around family violence, and part of their role is very much connecting with other agencies and connecting with communities. So I would expect, we had mention of a cocoon of local people keeping what was happening to themselves. I think we can actually learn from knowing that that is the experience and working in a different way to ensure that we keep women and children safe.
Thank you. And Detective Inspector, you get together with your police friends once a month for Friday drinks back in Kinglake. What did you hear about family violence?
Irregardless of the stories that I hear, family violence is not acceptable at any time. And police have a framework which they must enact when they attend a family violence incident, and that is based on our policy within the Code of Practice for the Investigation of Family Violence. And basically, they must do a proper risk assessment, which is considered a preliminary risk assessment under the Common Risk Assessment Framework. And from that, they can take criminal action, they can take civil action, and they absolutely should be making referrals for all parties involved.
Thank you. Now I wanted to draw the panel's attention to a case that came to your attention through a research report back in 2009. Can't imagine where that research report came from. Michelle, 24 years old and with a baby boy and a 2-year-old daughter. She returned to the area where her parents live, her childhood home, having left a violent relationship. On the morning of the fire, she narrowly survived, leaving her workplace and leaving stranded tourists down the mountain. She discovered in the following days that her workplace had burnt to the ground and people inside, her best friend, had died, and numerous people known to her had died. She was left unemployed and evicted from her home so the landlord could obtain higher rent in the now premium rental market. She and her children moved in with her parents. She had displacement, unemployment, grief, loss and trauma, but she was informed that she had not met the criteria for a case manager. Detective Inspector Hunnam, you remember the details from the research. The ex-partner returned from another state offering support and help with the children. Despite warnings from her parents, Michelle accepted his offer of help to get re-established. Within 1 week, he was physically violent. She took out an apprehended violence order, and on one violent occasion, the police turned up at 2 a.m. but didn't want to do anything. On another, they arrested him, but then did not show up at court. He breached the order on 4 occasions, still nothing was done. She's told by a friend who's a police officer that police were not attending as they were busy on important fire-related issues. Also, she was told the police didn't want to be too hard on the locals. It's good news. It's now 2016. You're in the top job. You're the police commissioner. Tell us, how could this situation come about?
First of all, I'd just like to say that I have no intention of deposing Ken Lay.
She says that now.
And the main reason for that is simply because Ken is already committed to the prevention of violence against women. He is a really vocal advocate about preventing this violence. So Ken gets it. And what better organisation to work for when your CEO actually gets it and is very supportive of the work that you're doing. So I'm not going to depose him, but I will advise him. Now, what would I advise him? Very much, I've already explained our options model and what we might do. In regard to potentially breaches of intervention orders and no action being taken, there's been a lot of discussion about forward planning, and I think what we would actually do is look to not only provide extra police for the response, which is what we do now. During Black Saturday, we certainly brought in members from the Force Response Unit and members from all over the state, but we'd actually ensure that there was enough police in the ground to continue community services as we would normally, so to ensure that that happens.
Okay, thank you. On another occasion, the ex-partner of Michelle returns and destroys the house, trashes the house and her professional tools. She calls the police, but they're not able to attend. She reports his neglect of their 2 toddlers. On a further occasion, she attends the local police station and shows them a death threat on her phone, and no action is taken. In the months and years after 2009, the death threats continue, along with threats of suicide, intimidation, extortion and so on. She now has a 30-kilometre restriction on her movements with the children. Helen Matthews, you're principal lawyer with the Women's Legal Service Victoria. Is there a clause in the Victorian Charter of Human Rights protecting freedom of movement? How can this happen? She hasn't done anything wrong, etc.
Look, I think the issue that's been raised is really not so much to do with the Charter, but looking at the question that arises in family law matters of relocation. And relocation is not something that's specifically dealt with in the Family Law Act. So Michelle really would need to be getting some advice about how it would be looked at if the matter did go to court. And that would be a court trying to balance the needs of children to have an ongoing relationship with the remaining parent and the needs of the parent who needs to escape or relocate. I think there was a period of time after the 2006 family law amendments which were looking at shared parenting when there was an over-emphasis in some decision making to upholding that need to spend time with children by the parent who was not looking up, the children were not residing with, more so than anything else. So hopefully that's not the situation now.
Okay, thank you. Jane Cooper, you've advised government what's in place in 2016 to prevent this situation happening again?
So much.
Not very much.
Basically, that the government has taken a considered and systematic approach in disaster recovery, which actually plans and prioritises for family violence to increase after a disaster. So that's actually something they take into consideration. Also, that government has decided that women and children who are experiencing family violence are considered a vulnerable group. So currently there are vulnerable groups that emergency looks after. So people, frail people, older people, people with disabilities. I want to see women and children who are experiencing family violence included in that vulnerable group. You know, family violence services actually having a presence in the recovery centres immediately after and in the months that follow. Family violence data gets collected. I think there's something worth saying. This might be a bit radical, but the idea of you know, considering how we do aid. So we give a family aid at the moment, and usually it's based on the head of household model. So, you know, there's a lot to be said in looking at what we do overseas when disasters happen. Aid organisations go over it and they actually find that it's much more effective if you give the aid to the women head of household, because that will equal a more fair distribution. So why would we do it overseas, but we don't do it here? It's worth talking about. And I just want to emphasise the importance of prevention. This is not all about response. Everything I've said so far has been about response, but I'm primarily a prevention worker now, and there's so much we can do before. When we're having bushfire info sessions and that kind of thing, we need to be talking about masculinity then. And we need to say that, you know, family violence is likely to occur when bushfires happen, and men do tend to do this, and women do tend to do this, and it's okay for men to cry, and it's okay for men to feel these things. So we need to be talking about family violence and gender in the, but before it even happens. And finally, I think there's a big role for local government to play. There's, you know, emergency management coordinators at many local governments, and working on how they can put this stuff into their plans.
Thank you. And we assume, of course, that Premier Burgess will be telling men that they can cry. Thank you very much. Kathy, can you just add very briefly a couple of ideas for prevention, just carrying on from that? Thank you.
So we've been hearing a lot about what I had to say at the start about gender roles. So, for example, I think we really need to be asking questions about why women are not being prepared for bushfires less than men? Why do they not feel confident to look after themselves during a bushfire? Why are they relying on their partners? And we also need to be asking why men are perpetrating violence in general and applying this to disaster situations. So in a 2011 report by Vic Health entitled Preventing Violence Against Women in Australia, they noted that the most significant determinants of violence against women are the unequal distribution of power and resources between men and women and an adherence to rigidly defined gender roles. Further, the report found that economic dependence intensifies barriers to disclosing family violence and seeking support. So these findings bear out the idea developed by feminist theorists that women and men exist in a gender hierarchy, where women are seen as second-class humans. And this gender hierarchy is enforced primarily through the imposition of gender roles, as I've been talking about. It's also enforced through violence, which is a method through which men communicate to women that they are subordinate. Now, with increasing women's equality, this inevitably means that some power is taken away from men, and some men respond to this using violence to reassert their dominance. And this has been shown by increasing rates of domestic violence following development programs in some third world countries. Intimate partner violence is especially common because historically marriage has been a relationship of an owner to a slave, in which the husband possessed control of the wife and could do anything he wanted to her. So clearly we have a system here that's fundamentally flawed, and fundamental flaws require fundamental change, but this is such a difficult and large goal that even activists have to put it aside sometimes and focus our energy on more achievable things. So, firstly, I think the fight to stop violence against women must be built on our knowledge. So we have to keep talking to one another and finding patterns and comparing ideas and sharing experiences. So basically exactly what we've been doing today. We have to continue to fight against the exploitation of women in every way so that we can begin to tackle those underlying gender hierarchy issues and not just individual surface symptoms. We can also change this system on a really basic level by just changing our behaviour. So if in our everyday lives we challenge gender stereotypes whenever we can, that's always going to help undo their hold on us. So we have to try and reduce these divisions between women and men and hope eventually to lead to an eradication of gender roles and pass these ideas on to our children so that we can eventually one day hopefully have a future without violence. Thank you.
After the Canberra fires, you, in your research, observed men and women reverting to quite rigid male and female gender roles. What do you think this was about?
I think it was about gender parity being only skin deep with some. And that in a crisis can go out the window. So, yes, women have to be really aware of that.
So it wasn't entrenched to begin with?
No. We're talking about California, Berkeley, and Canberra, Australia.
Yeah.
And recently. So we can lose our position quite quickly after crisis. So the message for us as women is to step forward into the public and take that back, which we did in both cases.
Thank you, Chris. Christine Erickson, you've been appointed the first Sex Discrimination Commissioner in Disasters and held the position since 2014, so you've had the job for a couple of years, you know exactly what's going on. What kinds of discrimination against women happened at all levels in disaster planning, response and recovery?
Well, sadly, I think a few years from now, the issue is still that gender very rarely guides official disaster management policy and practice. And one of the key things that really gets my blood boiling on a daily basis, which we haven't really touched much on today, is the role of mass media in making sure that gender stereotyping carries on in our everyday lives. As long as mass media continues to portray men as heroes in disasters and women as victims, the culture of turning a blind eye or excusing family violence during hardship or disaster, that's going to continue to inhibit efforts to mitigate and protect. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Lyndon, you had the year of your community for 16 years, a proven leader, mayor for 5 terms. One would expect that you're a key part of council's decision making in the weeks and months after Black Saturday fires. Can you tell us very briefly what happened?
I was ignored, quite simply. Sadly, I think that there were so many different pulls and pushes from every area that the bigger picture wasn't being totally looked at. And that's what we really needed. Within a few days after the disaster, in a discussion with the then CEO, I said, when's our recovery plan going to be developed? We don't need one. We'll be okay. And a bit of a shock came to the system there. So I'm sure that the Premier now is going to take a lot of this on board and not place on government, particularly local government, the position of having to have them deal with something that is beyond their capacity to be able to deal with in many, many ways. That the situation and circumstance of with councils being placed in a position of having to try to do the best they can, and pressure being, huge amount of pressure being placed on when you've got 43% of your shire being impacted and you've lost 107 people at a minimum, that there shouldn't be that expectation that they can do this on their own, because they certainly can't. And legislation is certainly needed to be implemented to ensure that there is that support and that partnership that is developed and that the community are being listened to. And that decision making is going to be undertaken on behalf of the whole community and not end up as a 1/6 vote on a number of occasions. So it is about the principles of standing up for the community, of having an authority there that has the legislative power to be able to do what they need to do, so that you do not get to the situation and circumstance of basically bullying, that occurs internally, because people want leadership and they need to see their leaders. And when the communities are seeing their leaders struggling themselves, that doesn't help anybody, and through no fault.
Very interesting. As a result of Lynn's experiences, she wrote a memoir. And the memoir was snapped up by SBS and turned into a 9-part series. I'm not sure why 9 parts, but let's go with it. And starring Kate Blanchett playing Lynn, which I think is a good choice. The series portrayed how the recovery was dominated by men and the sidelining of women. And Russell Crowe, fortunately, unfortunately, depending on your position, led an all-male task force in the film and uttered the memorable line, "Don't talk to me about women, we've got a disaster on our hands." But you'll be pleased to know the film did bomb, and Russell was extradited. Actually, I've decided with my powers to send him back to New Zealand with Lois. I hope she can talk some sense into him, if that's okay. I think we might actually wrap it up there, ladies and gentlemen, but we have got the opportunity for some questions. But before we have questions, can you please thank our fabulous hypothetical panel.
Yeah, look, I do agree with you, with what you said. In talking with a number of communities post-disasters, not just from the bushfires, but in Western Australia and Queensland, that was something that was actually identified, that you could train up people, but you also had to have an assessment process of people being able to identify themselves that they weren't capable, and saying themselves or somebody else. That's why you've got the peer support programs that I know that somebody has developed and working so well at, so that there is that circumstance where you can identify and then put in place others, and also from burnout, people who are just working so hard and they just end up falling in a heap themselves, that you have got other people there that can take over those roles. So it is about across the whole spectrum of assistance that you can provide.
I think the important thing that we've all, I'd like to think most of us have learned going through disaster, is that it gives you a new platform to start off, and that's about building capacity in community. And quite frankly, regardless of people that step up to be leaders, there is a lot of leaders in communities. We just haven't given them the chance to become leaders. But if we can start to build capacity, which helps resilience, even though it's not a word that I really like, I think capacity is what happens to communities after disaster.
I think that comment actually that it highlights the fact that we actually can have two sides of this situation. There's always two sides to a coin, and that we need to be able to feel like we can just breathe as well, even though we're as workers, you know, we're out there trying to do everything and do our best in our work. We also need, we're human beings too, we need to have time to recover as well, and just noticing that.
And in fact, I found when you were speaking also, Jane, speaking directly about experiences, that was the thing that was running through my head, was also how are you two and the various other workers on the ground coping with those kinds of situations.
One of the things that I wanted to say in the bit about what's been done to prevent this in the future was around that, you know, I think there needs to be a big change in the culture with CFAs and SESs and that sort of thing. So there's still a very blokey male culture going on there, and if we can work with these groups and, you know, encourage them to recruit more women and to take this issue seriously, I think that they could really step up and be major leaders in being able to prevent this stuff from occurring in the first place. So kind of like what I was saying before, like I want them to go in and start talking about masculinity in bushfire information sessions. I think that can happen. I'm not so sure about how I don't know who to go to talk to about the recovery money or whatever material aid is in place. I'm not sure if that's local governments who do that, or
Premier Burgess will handle it.
Oh good, Premier Burgess will handle it. But I certainly think that sort of the emergency services that are out there's a lot of training that could be done in that area, and they could step up and be really great leaders and champions of this work.
Just specifically in relation to targeting women being prepared for bushfires, which I thought was a fantastic point that you made. Gwyn, would you care to respond to that?
We are trialling a couple of programs at the moment. There's one occurring in the northwest of this state, which I think is called Fired Up Women. And I know my colleagues in the service in South Australia have Fiery Women. There are some programs like that around, but can I just stress that there's not a lot of penetration in the community per se around the need to plan for bushfire. So this situation is, and I like the point that Jan, or I think it was Jan made, that that these women who are in relationships where there's violence should be classified as vulnerable people.
I'll just say that's Deb Parkinson's idea, not my own, but it's a very good.
Yeah, and I don't disagree, and our organisation is working extremely hard to steer the definition of vulnerable people away from the traditional, and we're actually looking loosely at the concept of poverty, where we believe that vulnerability stems from a lack of resources. Not necessarily economic resources, but a whole range of resources. And one of the case studies was a fantastic case in point where the family had a single car. So they were, you know, what happened to the woman was she had no means of dealing with this. But unfortunately, in people's pool of concern in their lives, bushfire and the risk of disaster comes very low. So while they're worried about whether their partner's going to beat them up when he comes home from the pub and how they're going to buy their kids school shoes, and you know, they really don't worry about bushfire. And there's a lot of really complex psychological issues around the assessment of risk in people's lives. So there's no easy solution, but I hear what you're saying, and there's a number of things that we'd like to try. But I think you'll find that the women that come to these things like Fired Up Women are highly motivated, empowered women in the first place. And so we need to do something else, and we as women in our communities need to work harder to support our sisters in this space, because they aren't going to put up their hands to come to a bushfire session. They've got a whole lot of other stuff happening.
Yeah.
It actually struck me too when Jan talked about the case study where the woman's plan was my boyfriend or a partner or whatever, and I wondered for how many people the plan is someone else. Just generally, that someone else will kind of take care of it. You wanted to add something, Christine?
Yes, just very quickly, because one of the things that comes across very clearly in New South Wales is that women do worry about it, but the reason why it never makes it to the top of the list of priorities is because there's so many other things that competes against their time. One of the reasons why bushfire education and risk communication doesn't get across to women is because often it's not gender sensitive. It doesn't address the issues that are important to most women in their everyday lives. And so what a lot of the agencies are working with and what the Rural Fire Service in New South Wales is battling with is how to make it more gender sensitive, how to change the language so it's not a blokey language that assumes that you know certain things. And there's a great initiative by a lady called Jenny Filmer down near Queanbeyan. She called the program Firefighting for Non-Firefighting Women, and then realised that actually that applies just as much to all the men in her community. There's some really great initiatives out and about in Australia that targets gender much more specifically. It's just, it never quite makes it to the point where it gets the support from head office, and therefore it's never linked into a bigger picture.